Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of Rouse IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates. Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of the newspaper analysis from the Civil Services Examinations perspective. So today we are going to take up the Hindu Daily Edition dated 12th January 2022. The topics to be discussed have been displayed on your screen and the timestamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. So the first topic which we are going to discuss has appeared on page number 8. The topic reads, Treating the planet well can aid the progress. The crux of the overall topic is that from the policy planning perspective, an integrative perspective should be taken in order to take the social and environmental problems together. We should understand that social problems and the environmental problems are not in isolated patches and they are linked together. So, in this very regard, this complete article tells us about the necessity of taking the social and environmental dimensions in the policy formulations. Under this topic, we will come across the important concepts of the human development and the pressure adjusted human development index. We will also understand the concept of the planetary boundaries and we'll discuss in detail about all the 9 planetary boundaries taken by the Stockholm Resilience Center. From the UPSC scheme of syllabus point of view, these topics are very important in prelims as well as the mains examination. In prelims examination, this topic lies under the intersection of two micro topics, that is economic and social development, and the second topic is the general issues on environmental ecology, biodiversity and climate change that specifically do not require the subject specialization. Similarly, in mains examination, this topic lies in the intersection of the General Studies Paper 2 and Paper 3 in the Social Justice and Biodiversity and Environment section. And because of the high relevance of this topic, the questions are regularly asked in prelims as well as mains examination. Now, under this topic, we are going to discuss an important indicator, that is of the United Nations Development Programs, which has advised to come up with a new indicator. And by analyzing the previous year questions from the UPSC prelims examination, there have been questions asked on the specific indicators and the parameters on which those indicators are based. For example, the question was asked in UPSC 2012 related to multidimensional poverty index, and you have to find the correct parameters out of the given these 3 parameters, which were the deprivation of education, health, assets and services at household level, purchasing power parity at national level, and extent of budget deficit and GDP growth rate at national level. Now, specific concept related questions have been asked in UPSC mains. For example, recently in 2019 mains, the question was asked in relation to the concept of the carrying capacity. The question asked that define the concept of the carrying capacity of an ecosystem as relevant to an environment. Also, you were asked to explain that how the understanding of this very concept is vital while planning for the sustainable development of a region. Now, if you closely analyze this question is nothing but the intersection of two important parts, that is ecology and the social development. So that is why it is said that UPSC experts that we should have interdisciplinary knowledge of all the dimensions which are there mentioned in the UPSC syllabus. And hence we will discuss this very article in much detail. So the context of this article is that 2020 Human Development Report, which all of you know that is published by the United Nations Development Programme, that is UNDP, titled The Next Frontier, Human Development and Anthropocene, proposed a planetary pressure adjusted human development index. Now, from this context, two important words emerge. One is the Anthropocene and other is the human development. Now, first you need to understand that what exactly do we mean by Anthropocene. Now, this word is made out of two words. One is the anthro and other is the scene. Anthro, as we know, is related to the humans, that is the human induced impacts, and the scene is generally related to the geological time scale. So this word specifically mentions the present geological time scale whereby most of the natural changes are driven out of the anthropogenic activities. For example, when we talk about that recently the climate change is happening. For example, we talk about the sixth phase of biological mass extinction. We conclude that though the climate change is a natural process, but because of the anthropogenic factors like industrialization, urbanization, and land use, the rate of the climate change is excessively high, and because of which there is a drastic loss of biodiversity throughout the globe. And that is why this present time is a special geological era whereby the human induced impacts are mainly driving the natural as well as artificial changes, and that is why this present geological timescale should be called as Anthropocene. Now, the second word is related to the human development, which has a general connotation. It has certain objective as well as subjective criterias. Now, let me ask you to have a certain exercise. You yourself think that if you have to define that what exactly human development is, how will you define it? Do you have any objective, clear cut, and all encompassing definition of human development? Can you define that what exactly the development can mean? So that is why let us think about the human development as a concept in itself. Because if we understand the human development concept, only then we will understand this particular topic and the dimension which UPSC is continuously hitting in each examination in prelims as well as mains. So here I have tried to divide the concept of the human development in two broad indicators. One of the parameters can be tangible, which are easily quantifiable and can be easily measured, but the other things are intangible in nature also. For example, when we talk about the Human Development Index as given by the United Nations Development Programme, we say that the UNDP takes several criteria into account to measure the Human Development Index. For example, it uses GDP per capita. So this GDP per capita is a quantifiable term, and that is why I have taken this one thing into a tangible part. And so there can be endless and n number of indicators in tangible as well as the intangible list. Here I have taken few of them. For example, under tangible list I have taken income, purchasing power parity, literacy rate, the sex ratio, the health related indicators, for example, infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, trade, etc. Because somehow all these parameters are important to elevate the levels of development of human beings. For example, if a family is having a better income, it will have a better standard of living, it will have a better health indicators, better education related indicators, and better employment opportunities. So logically, that family will be having a better socio-economic developmental levels as compared to those family which are having lower income levels. However, this statement is not in absolute sense because development is not only about the income or the development is not only about the tangible parameters. For example, we take two societies that is A and B, and in society we have a very high per capita income. But here the people are living out of huge stress. The societal tendencies in these societies are very high. But on the other hand, the society B is not having such high income levels, but the social capital of that society, that is love, harmony, trust, fraternity, in that society is good. And that is why that society will be having a better well being. So, what do you will conclude? Whether the society A has greater human developmental levels or the society B has greater human development levels. And here is where come the intangible parameters. For example, the social capital. For example, the level of knowledge and education. Now, here one very important difference lies. You should understand the difference between the literacy and the true knowledge and education. The literacy is the tangible aspect, but the knowledge, the education is the intangible aspect. A person might be highly knowledgeable, highly educated, but might be the literacy rates are not very high. And on the other hand, we can have a highly literate population, but the wisdom, the knowledge, the education of that person might be not up to that mark. Similarly, when we talk about the sex ratio in the tangible part, now if a society is having a better sex ratio, does that conclude that society is also having the equal opportunities for the males and females? Can we conclude for a society having a better sex ratio that that very society is also having the equal empowerment of all the genders? No. So that is the difference between the tangible and the intangible thing. The society might be having a favorable sex ratio, but still the empowerment levels might greatly differ. Similarly, when we talk about the quantifiable health indicators, we must also talk about the good health of the society or the people, the good diet of the societies, and these diets will vary across different societies. So, all these things, the tangible and the intangible things, will be the part of the overall human development. And that is why the concept of the human development is multidimensional. And in this very sense, there are several indicators by multiple international organizations which have tried in their own way to measure the human development. For example, you all know about the Human Development Index, Gender Inequality Index, Inequality Adjusted HDI, and Multidimensional Poverty Index. So, in this very regard, the context of this topic says that the 2020 Human Development Report of the United Nations Development Programme proposed a planetary pressure adjusted human development index. So now there is one more factor, that is the planetary pressure which UNDP is proposing to take into account to measure the human development. Because you need to understand that out of all these parameters which we discussed, we have missed one very important parameter, that is the climate change. Now you think and understand that will not the variable climate across different regions in the world will have a direct or indirect impact on human development? Let us see how. Just think about that. Will the climate impact the income of any person or society? Will the climate impact the literacy levels? Will the climate impact the health outcomes? Will the climate impact the social capital? Yes, it will. For example, if a society is entirely dependent upon the agriculture for their income, and we know that because of the climate induced disasters, the agricultural productivity of many countries are drastically reducing. So if the productivity is reduced, obviously that will be have a direct bearing on the income levels and in turn will have a direct bearing on the human development indicators. So that is why now UNDP says that we should take this climate aspect also in measuring the human development. And that is why it comes across an important indicator, that is the pressure adjusted HDI. In short form it is called as PHDI. So now let us understand that what do we exactly mean by the PHDI, what are its important components and the basic underlying philosophy of this very indicator. So to understand the planetary pressure adjusted human development index, we should first understand the basic definition of this indicator. The UNDP defines it as an experimental index that adjusts the Human Development Index HDI for planetary pressures in the Anthropocene. The PHDI discounts the HDI for pressures on the planet to reflect a concern for the intergenerational inequality. And this is the basic concept of the sustainable development also. Just recollect the concept of sustainable development in your mind. What is the basic definition of the sustainable development which we have studied? Sustainable development takes account into the needs of the present generation, but it also takes about the needs of the future generation. That is, the sustainable development is based on the intergenerational equity and equality. And in this very sense, the PHDI measures the level of human development when planetary pressures are considered. So the PHDI takes two important adjustment factors in its formula. The first one is the CO2 emissions per capita, and the other is the material footprint per capita index. Now these two factors are very important from your prelims point of view also. So how a PHDI is calculated, the arithmetic mean of these two indicators are taken, and this arithmetic mean becomes the adjustment factor for the planetary pressures. This adjustment factor is then multiplied with the Human Development Index score, which was calculated in the manner as earlier. And the product of the HDI and this adjustment factor becomes the new planetary pressure adjusted HDI, that is PHDI. So the value ranges between 0 to 1, and the value near to the 1 will have a low planetary pressures, and the value near to 0 will be having high planetary pressures. Again, this fact is very important from the prelims point of view. And from this very aspect, now we should understand the concept of the planetary boundaries. So, the concept of the planetary boundaries was first provided by the scientists of the Stockholm Resilience Center in 2009. And these planetary boundaries are nothing but the thresholds which humanity can survive. For example, you might be knowing about the human footprints. You might be knowing about the Earth Overshoot Day. So all these things are nothing but just tell us about the thresholds, that whether our anthropogenic activities are within the limit or they are breaching the limits. And these are the boundaries which the planet can survive. So that is why these are the thresholds which a humanity can survive, and these planetary boundaries denote two important things, that is resilience and stability of our planet. And this concept takes 9 boundaries into account, which is shown in this very picture, and we will discuss all these 9 boundaries in detail, so that if the question comes in mains on the concept of the planetary boundaries, you are able to answer that particular question. Now we will discuss these boundaries one by one. The first boundary is related to the climate change, and you all are aware about the Paris deal and the recent IPCC report. The Paris deal aims to restrict the rise of the temperature to 2 degrees Celsius with a reference level of the pre-industrial levels. And in this regard, IPCC recently has come up with a report and has urged the nations worldwide to restrict the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because the IPCC is of the opinion that if the temperature rises beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, the changes in this planet will be irrevocable and irreversible. So, somehow, these are the boundaries in relation to the climate change for our planet. The second important indicator is the biosphere integrity. This biosphere integrity is based upon the ecosystem connectivity, because it believes that all the ecosystems are not in the isolated patches. For example, when we talk about different ecosystems, let's say oceans, mountains, and forests, all these ecosystems are somehow interrelated to each other. For example, let's say if there is a rise in temperature, the sea level will rise. If the sea level will rise, there will be flooding in the forests, and which ultimately will lead to a disease outbreak, and there will be a huge scale deforestation. This deforestation will release the methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas, and it will again rise the temperature, which will melt the glaciers in the mountains. This in turn will increase the level of the rivers, which in turn will increase the ocean levels. So somehow all the ecosystems are interrelated to each other. And that is why the planetary boundary of the biosphere integrity aims to increase the reforestation across the world. The third thing is the land system change, which is primarily based on the land use changes. We all know that because of the increase in industrialization and urbanization, there is a large scale concretization across the world. There have been reports termed such as changing green land into concrete land. So these reports show that how the entire area of the Greenland is being converted into concrete land. And that is why, because of such drastic land use changes, the carbon sequestration capacity of our planet is reducing. And that is why this makes the important boundary of our planetary resilience. The fourth important thing is the fresh water use. We all are aware about the water scarcity which the world is facing. You might be aware about the Sudan war crisis, and the scarcity of water was one of the important factor behind those wars. Several experts are of the opinion that there might be water wars in Asia as well. The water stress and water scarcity in India is also rising, And that is why the fresh water is the next important boundary of our planetary resilience and stability. The fifth thing is related to the biogeochemical cycles, and this very concept points out two important biogeochemical cycles. The first one is the nitrogen cycle, and the other one is the phosphorus cycle. And this concept lays the boundary of 25% of the nitrogen use with reference to the present as a planetary boundary. The sixth important thing is related to the ocean acidification. The sixth thing is related to the ocean acidification. We all know that because of the reduced marine diversity and increase in the thermal pollution of the oceans, the pH value of these ocean bodies are reducing, which in turn are changing the chemical compositions of the ocean. And this change in chemical composition will directly impact the dissolved oxygen content, and this in turn will negatively impact the marine diversity. Next important thing is related to the aerosol loadings of the atmosphere. Now, this aerosol loading is natural as well as artificial, and because of the presence of huge amount of aerosol in the atmosphere, it is believed that there is a huge alteration in the heat budget because the radiations coming from the sun on striking upon these aerosol particles are reflected back to the space. And that is why the amount of heat which earlier was reaching the ground surface is not reached now. And that is why this alteration of the heat budget is overall cooling the atmosphere, and it is impacting the overall heat budget and stability of our planet. The eighth important thing is related to the stratospheric ozone depletion. We all know that the vehicular and the industrial emissions were the important factors behind creation of the ozone hole in the stratosphere. However, one important light of hope is that with the enactment and the enforcement of the Montreal Protocol, this ozone depletion has been tackled to a very great extent, and this shows that how the national and international concerted efforts are instrumental in tackling the climate change, and we have the required and necessary strength to restrict our anthropogenic activities within the planetary boundaries. And the last important thing is the novel entities. Now, this term is also very important. You must be aware that what exactly do we mean by the novel entities. Novel entities are nothing but the new chemicals which are created out of the human activities. And one of the biggest negative impact of these new chemicals are on the bird population. Because when the birds feed upon certain things on the land, they accidentally also take up the chemicals by mouth, or somehow they also inhale these chemicals. It has altered the bird population levels. So, this was the extensive discussion on all the nine aspects of the planetary boundaries, and I hope that you have well understood this concept. Now, we will summarize this whole topic in a brief manner. Now, this topic has appeared on page number 8 in relation to the integrated planning of the environmental and social indicators. And in this very regard, we discussed that how this topic is very important in the prelims as well as the mains examination. In line with this, we discussed the tangible and the intangible aspects of the human development and number of reports by the UNDP in order to measure the human development. But from this concept, we concluded that human development is a mix of objective as well as the subjective connotations, and that is why it is not easy to take each and every parameter which affects the developmental levels. But because we have to measure the human developmental levels, we prioritize certain indicators over the others. And in this very regard, in this evolution of the concept of the human development, UNDP has come up with taking the climate change, the planetary pressures into account to measure the human development index. And here we saw that two important factors in this indicator are CO2 emissions per capita index and the material footprint per capita index. Then we also discussed about the definition of PHDI, and then in detail we discussed about the concept of the planetary boundaries. Now here last one very important thing is which should be noted is that in PHDI the two indicators which we have taken is in the terms of per capita, that is CO2 emissions per capita and the material footprint per capita. So this means that if we talk about India, where the population is very high, Our CO2 emissions per capita and the material footprint per capita will be on the lower side as compared to other countries. And this means that when India is compared with other countries in terms of HDI and PHDI, India should perform better in PHDI. Now, if this is true, this means that the ranking of India should improve in PHDI as compared to HDI. So now you should find out the rankings of India in HDI and in the same year the ranking of India in PHDI. So moving on to our next topic, which has again appeared on page number 8 in the editorial section, and the heading of the topic is the straws in the wind. This topic is in recent context of the defections which have taken place in the state of Goa and Uttar Pradesh. Now, the topics of defection and the anti-defection law in this very context is very important from the examination point of view in prelims and again in the mains examination. If we go by the UPSC scheme of syllabus, this topic finds relevance in the General Studies Paper 2 in the Governance, Constitution and Polity section and the micro section of the Parliament, state legislatures, structure, functioning, conduct of business, powers and privileges and issues arising out of these. Going by the previous year questions in UPSC 2013, it asked the questions specifically in the context of the freedom of speech, linking it with the anti-defection law. The question read that the role of the individual MPs, that is, members of the parliament, has diminished over the years, and as a result, the healthy constructive debates on policy issues are not usually witnessed. How far can this be attributed to the anti defection law, which was legislated but with a different intention? Now, the context of this very question will be discussed in today's session also, and other dimensions of the anti defection law, the 10th schedule, the 52nd amendment, and every related aspect will be covered in today's session. So, in this very regard, let us begin our discussion by first introducing that what do we exactly mean by the defection. The defection is basically the floor switching. You might have heard this news number of times that whenever in a state the election approaches or the Lok Sabha election approaches, there are several legislators which belong to party A and they switch to the party B in the hope of better political opportunities in the party B. And similarly, many of the legislators of Party B switched to Party C, and legislators from the Party C switched to Party A. So, this is basically what is known as horse trading, and primarily these are because of the personal selfish motives. Sometimes the motive is of power, and sometimes the motive is of money. And that is why it creates a political instability at the central or the state level. Because when the legislators from one party move to the other party, this specific party becomes in a minority and thereby providing the opportunity to the party B to form the government. However, it is also the breach of the public faith because the public had chosen the members of the party A to govern them. But because the legislators now have moved to party B, the party B, who erstwhile was rejected by the public, is now forming the government in that particular state. So that is why it is said that this horse trading is a breach of the public faith as well as it also goes against the constitutional morality. The constitutional principles have laid the responsibility on the shoulders of the legislators to govern our country in the ethical way following the constitutional principles. They are not only responsible but also accountable to the public. But as we see that the legislators of different parties are hopping their loyalty to other parties, we can easily say that they do not care about their being accountable to the general public. And that is why this defection goes against the constitutional morality. And in order to tackle this horse trading and to provide the political stability, the anti defection law was passed by the 52nd Amendment Act. So, the 52nd Constitutional Amendment Act was passed in order to insert the 10th schedule in the Indian Constitution. Further, in Indian Constitution, Article 102 specifically deals with the defection also. So this 10th schedule specifically provided four criteria or the four conditions whereby this anti-defection law can be enforced. The first one was that the member of the house belonging to a political party on whose ticket that member is elected in that particular house will be considered disqualified for being the member of that house in case he voluntarily gives up the membership of that political party. That means, for example, if person A is elected on behalf of party B to the house and he voluntarily gives his membership after coming to the house from the party B, then he will be considered as disqualified to be the member of that house. This sounds logical because if I am being elected on behalf of my party and in near future I give up my membership of that party, then I am liable to be disqualified and I do not belong to that political party, and that is why I cannot be the member of that particular house. So that is why the person who belongs to a political party voluntarily gives up the membership of that political party after coming to the house, he will be considered as disqualified. The second condition was that the member will also be disqualified if he votes in contrary to the whip issued by the political party. That means, for example, there is a bill A and the party has issued a whip to all its legislators that they have to vote in favor of this particular bill. If any member of that political party in that house votes against this bill, he will be liable to be disqualified. Now, this you should also analyze in the context of the freedom of speech under Article 19. If the legislator is not able to exercise his freedom of speech and if his personal conscience is not in favor of that particular bill, one can say that he must have the freedom of speech under Article 19 in that very house also. And that is why he cannot be forced to vote in against his or her own conscience. Because if we do not allow the opinions and the counter opinions in the parliament, then how can we expect a fruitful, helpful, and productive discussions on the particular bills which are introduced in the parliament? And that is why this particular provision has invited a stark criticism from the experts that it hampers the freedom of speech and deteriorates the quality of discussions in the House. The third important condition was related to the independent members. The law said that if the independent members after being elected to the house joins any political party, they will be considered as disqualified. And similar thing was also in association with the nominated members, with one difference that the nominated members, if they join political party after the 6 months period, then they will be considered as disqualified. That means that the nominated members were allowed to join any political party within 6 months after the date of their election in that house. But this very law also provided two important exceptions. The first exception was related to the merger. We have discussed that a person cannot give up the membership of the political party on whose behalf he or she is elected in that house, and therefore he or she cannot switch to the other party. But if two-thirds of the members of that political party decide to switch to the other party, that will be considered not as a defection but as a merger. And that is why the merger was allowed by this particular law. And the second exception was related to the speaker. Because in India, the speaker is also selected among the legislators who are elected on the behalf of political party. So once a person who is elected on the behalf of the party in the house is appointed as a speaker, he or she may resign from the political party and that will not be considered as defection. This was done in order to enforce and ensure the independence of the institution of the speaker. Further, this law provided the final decision power to the Speaker or the Chairman of the House. Whether any member is disqualified under this particular law has to be finally decided by the presiding officer of that particular House. And his or her decision shall be final in that particular case. But in very important case, the Hoto Holohan case, it was laid down by the Supreme Court that the decision of the Speaker or the Chairman in this context will be subject to the judicial review. But the overall practice of this anti defection law is valid under the Constitution. So the important thing is that though this decision of the Speaker and Chairman is final in this regard, but it can be challenged in the court of law. But here, if you closely analyze, there are certain issues. The first issue we have already discussed, which is in regard to the freedom of speech. The second issue is that why the difference has been laid between the independent members and nominated members, and why this specific time period has been provided to nominated members and not to the independent members. And the third issue is that why the individual defections are discouraged but the mass defections in the form of mergers are allowed by this law. So these issues have come up and continuously comes up before every election in almost every state. And in this very regard, there are some important recommendations which are laid down by the experts to amend the 10th schedule and strengthen the institution of anti-defection in letter and spirit. So let us see some important recommendations made by National Committee to Review the Working of Constitution and Dinesh Goswami Committee in this regard. The first is that they have recommended to amend the 10th schedule and to ban all the kinds of defections and not to differentiate between the individual defections and the mass defections in the form of merger. The second important recommendation is that the defectors must contest fresh elections in order to become the member of the House again. The contesting the fresh election by the defectors as defecting by the members would result in the loss of the membership of the House concerned. The third recommendation is that the defectors should be debarred from holding any type of public office or any other remunerative political post for the remaining term. The fourth important recommendation is that only those votes which are there to topple the government or which have the bearing that the government might lose its majority in the House or the government might be toppled, only those votes should be considered as grounds for defection. For example, the votes in case of money bill. Now, if the whip has been issued by the political party to vote in favor of the money bill, and if any member votes against that particular money bill, it can have a bearing on the stability of the government. And that is why such votes can be considered as a ground for defection, but this ground should not be there in ordinary bills. And in case of ordinary bills, the freedom of speech of the legislators must be respected. And the fifth and the last recommendation in this regard is that the speaker should not be the deciding authority on the cases of defection. Because we have discussed that speakers themselves are the part of the political party, generally the ruling party in the House. So that is why there always lies skepticism and question on the loyalty of the institution of the speaker, because they will have a general alienation towards their political party. And that is why it is recommended that the matters of defection should be tackled by the Election Commission of India, and this was also supported by the 170th Law Commission report. In this very regard, there is an important Supreme Court judgment recently in the Kesham Magchandra Singh versus Union of India case. So we should also go through these recommendations in very brief. The first was that a decision on the anti-defection of the Speaker operates independently of the other decision of the House and is not subject to the approval of the House. The second important thing was that the immunity from the judicial review is only from the parliamentary procedure, because in Kihoto Holohan case we have discussed that the decision of the Speaker or the Chairman is subject to the judicial review. That means that the decision of the Speaker on anti-defection can be judicially reviewed, and only the procedure followed cannot be judicially reviewed. The third important thing was that the grounds of the judicial review can be infirmities based on violation of the constitutional mandates, malafide, non-compliance with the rules of the natural justice, and perversity. Next, it was laid down that the Speaker or the Chairman in this regard will act as a quasi-judicial authority, and thereby they will have the judicial power in this very regard. Further, an important thing was also laid down, that was in relation to the time. The Supreme Court quoted Kyoto Holohan case where it held that Speaker, while deciding the case of the anti-defection, must decide within a reasonable time and should not take more than 3 months. The court said that the period of the 3 months has been kept in mind considering the life of the Lok Sabha and the State Legislative Assembly, which is 5 years. So, summing up the entire topic in brief, again, this topic has appeared in the editorial section on the page number 8 in the context of the recent defections in the state of Goa and Uttar Pradesh. Under this topic, we discussed that what do we mean by defection and what negative impact does it create on India's democracy in terms of political instability, breach of public faith, and breach of constitutional morality. Then, in order to tackle this defection, an anti-defection law was passed and 52nd Constitutional Amendment Act was enacted to insert the 10th schedule, and it laid down 4 situations whereby anti-defection law will be enforced. But there are certain exceptions in terms of merger, and the office of Speaker was exempted from this defection law. Further, this very law gave the final decision making power to the presiding officer of the House, that is, the Speaker or the Chairman. But this final decision was subject to judicial review as laid down the Supreme Court in Kyoto Holohan case. But because there are certain issues in anti-defection law which we discussed with regard to the freedom of speech, independency of the legislators, difference between the nominated and independent members, office or the institution of the Speaker, the partiality and the skepticism associated, and difference between the individual or mass defections, there are certain recommendations made by NCRWC and Dinesh Goswami Committee. Further, in this very regard, in the last we discussed about the recent Supreme Court judgments, which most importantly laid down the time limit of the 3 months on the office of Speaker to decide the cases of defection, and it laid down that the procedure followed cannot be judicially reviewed, but once the decision is taken, it is subject to the judicial review. Moving on to our third topic, which has appeared on page number 6. This topic is in relation to the Pradhan Mantri Kusum Yojana, and the topic reads that the solar power is all set to brighten the lives of the farmers, and this topic has come in the context of the state of Rajasthan. Now, this topic is much relevant from the prelims examination point of view because in the prelims we have a syllabus of social sector initiatives. Though this scheme is not new, but you should be aware about the schemes which are there in 1 to 2 years, because recently the trend has been observed that UPSC is asking questions from the current affairs of last 1 to 1.5 years. And that is why you need to know the important features of this particular scheme. So the context of this news is that the solar power generation is set to make rapid strides in the Rajasthan because the public sector banks have acceded to the state government's request to grant the loans without collateral security. Now this is very important step because Rajasthan has been a leading state as far as this particular scheme is concerned. And that is why the state government have requested the public sector banks to provide the loans without the collateral security to the farmers for installing the solar plants at their infertile or semi-barren land. Now from this very context, you might have guessed the important objective or the aim of this particular scheme and the broader subject of this scheme. Nevertheless, we will discuss the important features of this scheme. The broader objective of this particular scheme is twofold. On one hand, it aims to ensure the energy security, and on the other hand, it also aims to ensure the incomes to the farmers. Because this particular scheme works on the principle that the farmer will install the solar pumps on their wasteland, and the electricity generated out of those solar plants can be traded and can be connected to the electricity grid. And in this very regard, an important key fact for the prelims point of view is that Rajasthan became the first state to complete the selection of the farmers for the installation of the solar plants on their land in July 2021, with the capacity exceeding the targets set by the Union Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. Now, the important features of the Kusum scheme are represented in this following diagram. Under this scheme, it is aimed that around 27.5 lakh solar water pumps will be distributed among the farmers, and around 17.5 lakh pumps will be installed off grid to aid the irrigation needs of the farmers in remote locations. Moreover, 10 lakh pumps will be installed in locations where the grid is available along with the solarization of the existing pumps. Now, this is a very important feature of this scheme. Further, as we have discussed, the farmers can sell the surplus solar power generated off grid to discoms to earn around rupees 60,000 annually per acre. Further, the grid-connected solar power plants of up to 2 megawatt capacity each will be installed in the rural areas. So, in this very sense, on one hand, it aims to ensure the energy security, and on the other hand, it aims to boost the income generation because farmers will sell the surplus solar power generated to the discoms, and it will also aid the irrigation to boost the agriculture in rural areas. Our next topic is from the page number 12 in relation to the Ganga Sagar Mela. Now, this topic is again important from the prelims point of view. And this topic has come in the context that amid the COVID 19 crisis, which our country is battling because of the new variant of concern that is Omicron, the government and the High Court of Kolkata has imposed the restrictions on the Ganga Sagar Mela. The Calcutta High Court has said that negative RT-PCR is must for attending the event. So, in this very regard, we should know all the key facts related to the Ganga Sagar Mela from the culture point of view to answer the questions related to this specific festival in preliminary examination. The first important thing is the location of the Ganga Sagar Mela. The Ganga Sagar is the village and a gram panchayat located in the state of West Bengal. And this map shows the location of the Sagar Islands, that is on the banks of the Ganga Brahmaputra Delta. Now, this very place is also known as the place of the penance by Kapil Muni. And the cultural aspects related to this particular festival is that the Ganga Sagar is a place of Hindu pilgrimage. Every year on the day of Makar Sankranti, that is 14th and 15th January, hundreds of thousands of Hindus gather to take a holy dip at the confluence of river Ganges and Bay of Bengal. And during this festival, they also offer the prayers in the Kapil Muni temple. Now you should memorize this fact that the Kapil Muni temple is located in this very area. Now this pilgrimage is held annually on the Sagar Island's southern tip where the Ganga enters the Bay of Bengal. This pilgrimage and the fair is the second largest congregation of the mankind after the triennial ritual bathing of Kumbh Mela. So this was a very small topic relevant from the preliminary examination point of view, and that is why we have not got into much details. Here only those facts are taken which are important for us to answer the prelims questions. So our next topic has appeared on page number 3. Now this topic is important from the perspective of a very important terminology, that is lone wolf. We need to be aware about this terminology because this can be asked in the prelims examination as such. This terminology is linked with the internal security, and that is why this topic appears in the General Studies paper 3 in the micro section of the role of external state and non-state actors in creating a challenge to internal security. Now, this topic has appeared in the context of the recent Bully Bhai controversy. You might have heard about this news that there was an app which was created known as Bully Bhai, where the people from a specific community were targeted. And in this very regard, this important term has emerged. So now we will look at what do we exactly mean by the lone wolf. But before understanding the concept of lone wolf, let us just go through the conventional terrorist attacks which used to take place in different countries. So earlier at the back end, there were organizations like ISIS, Al Qaeda, Lashkar, etc. These organizations organized a training camps whereby a dedicated trainings are provided to the terrorists, and those terrorists were trained in arms and ammunitions. Then these terrorists further provided the material support to other people. The recruitment was done in different countries and regions, and the material support was provided to those people. Further, these people were also involved in the radicalization of the youth of different countries, and these radicalized youth were again taken back to these training camps for the further trainings. And after all this recruitment and the proper training process, the attacks were carried out. But one important thing here was that during this entire process, there were several mistakes and loopholes which were done by these terrorists, and these were intercepted by our intelligence agencies like RAW, IB, CBI, etc. So, this was a methodology which was adopted in the conventional terror attacks. But nowadays, especially in the Western countries, lone wolf attacks are taking place. Now, lone wolves are the self motivated individuals which conduct the violent act of terrorism. They are outside the command structure, which means that they are not supported by an organization like they used to were in the conventional terror attacks. And that is why, because they are outside the centralized command structure, no material assistance is provided to them by the organizations. They are self motivated individuals and they are influenced by the ideology of specific organization. This means that lone wolves are those people who follow some organizations but are not formally the part of that organizations. They might be self radicalized or they might be the targets of other organizations, but they are outside the centralized command structure and no assistance is provided to them. Now, the biggest challenge in tackling the lone wolf is that this entire process, which we discussed, that there might existed some loopholes or mistakes which were intercepted by RAW, IB, and CBI. This process is not there in case of lone wolves, and that is why these people are very difficult to intercept. And hence, this has become one of the emerging trends in conducting the terror attacks. Most of the times you come across the news is like one or two people just fire randomly on the crowd without any clear objective, without any centralized command. Those attacks are typically the lone wolf attacks. So from now onwards, wherever you read this term lone wolf, you will be able to understand the context of that particular news. So, our next topic is the reference article which has appeared on page number 8. This article is in relation to the GST compensation issue and the suggested reforms therein. Now, the issue of the GST Council and the GST compensation was already discussed in the DNS of 18 September 2021, whereby the composition, the decision making, and the quorum required for the GST Council was discussed, and the GST compensation mechanism was also discussed. So, thereby, you are requested to go back to the DNS of 18 September 2021 in order to understand the issue and the reforms in a holistic manner. And next topic has appeared on page number 9 in relation to the hate speech. Now, this topic is in very much news because of the recent controversy which was there in the Haridwar, and that is why you need to be aware about the dimension of the hate speech and how does it counter with the freedom of speech under Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. Now, again, this is a reference article because this complete issue was discussed in detail in the DNS of 21st September 2021, whereby the freedom of expression was typically linked with the hate speech and the difference between the both and the reasonable restrictions to the freedom of speech and expression were also discussed. Further, the 21st September 2021 TNS also discussed the Representation of the People's Act, that what is the position of the RPA 1951 with regard to the hate speech. So again you are requested to go back to watch the DNS of 21st September 2021 in order to holistically understand this complete issue, which will be very instrumental in answering your mains questions. So now is the time for the question of the day, and the question asked in yesterday's DNS was related to the Jallikattu festival. The question asked you to identify the state which is famous for Jallikattu festival, and the correct answer for this question is option C, because Tamil Nadu is the one state which is very famous for the Jallikattu festival, which is a bull taming event. The question for today's DNS is in front of you, and this question is in relation to the Ganga Sagar fair. The two statements are given and you have to find the correct statement out of these two statements.